My area of training is as a historian, and sometimes historians like to play armchair ethnographers. Our strategy is a little different than what an anthropologist would have, so please excuse as some of you who've been better trained in field work will say, he's not doing this right. Again, historians do ethnography slightly differently. Ethnographies of reading often employ the fieldwork techniques to observe, record, interpret, and report on the activities of persons who read text alone or in social settings. That task is more difficult when we discuss the reading habits of people long since dead. What follows in the talk that I'll give you is an analysis of evangelical periodicals read by Methodists and Baptists in Illinois, Missouri, and Iowa between the 1840s and 1880s. To reconstruct their reading habits, I analyzed the content of those papers, particularly the form and structure of content, and the instructions to the readers on how to read these papers. In other instances, I looked at first-hand accounts of readers recalling their practices or discussing those practices within the content of the paper themselves. I have four basic observations when I look at these evangelical readers. First, that the domestic sphere, so the home, was the site of evangelical periodical reading. Second, the family was the social environment for reading, and that environment reinforced patriarchal structures. Third, the content that readers encountered was a composite of religious and secular material and of information from local, state, regional, national, and global spheres. And fourth, the compression of that content within a few pages shaped the reader's worldviews to prioritize their religious and regional interests as the standard to which they compared all other information that they read. My thesis, then, is that the evangelical reading habits of 19th century fomented a regional consciousness rooted in a religious paradigm. To many evangelicals, the home was an especially important site of religious practice. If, quote, socially prayer should be daily, went one editorial of the Central Christian Advocate, quote, where but in the family, the society which is abiding and which is a single roof covers, and it with proprietary be daily, end quote. The article further advanced that family prayer was more appropriate than public prayer meetings. Should there be public prayer religious services daily or daily prayer meetings for this purpose? The article continued. Then how suitable is it that those who together share their daily bread should together daily ask for it? The article reflected the evangelicals' understanding of the home and the family as the basic unit of society. Praying families were at the core of a praying public and a praying nation. The home was not only the space where evangelicals met for religious exercises, it was in the home that children received their initial religious instruction. Often adults recalled those instructions and roles that their homes and their parents played. William Davis recalled that parents were, quote, earnest Christians, members of the Baptist Church, who observed family worship, and it was in the home that I received those first religious impressions that have lasted through all the passing years, end quote. George Greer had a similar experience in a Methodist home, quote, where the family altar was never neglected, regular attendance in Sunday school and church always secured by parents taking us to the house of God, end quote. The precipitate, Greer concluded, was that his home was orderly and the children behaved. He finished his comments by saying, the rod was seldom used, end quote. Evangelical periodicals encouraged religion in the home by providing articles that discuss the home as the space where people gain spiritual and behavioral improvement. For example, the Central Christian Advocate affirmed that, quote, the strength of religion in the earth is the family, end quote. The family remained the sanctuary of religious vitality despite the forces that suppress public displays of religion. Quote, in times of terror and distress, it has always fled thither. As unto a place of refuge, there it has subsisted. When the synagogue has been leveled with the ground, and the servants of the Lord compelled to flee for their lives to the dens and caves of earth or foreign lands, end quote. As this article illustrates, evangelicals promote the family as the bedrock of their Christian faith. The home was also the place in which family members could reform their manners through mutual affection and sentiment. In 1847, an article, The Culture of the Hearth, in the Western Christian Advocate, defended the domestic affections. It stated, "Now is there any sight in this world more unnatural or uninviting than a family without hearts? A home where hate and its whole brood of evil have undisputed sway. Children whose affections are not cultivated are, at best, but half human. They despise each other when together, and when separate they have no disposition to think of each other, much less cherish sentiments of filial love and affiliation and affection." End quote. Articles like this promoted the affections of necessary component to one's moral improvement. Turning to the home as the location where these affections were strongest, evangelicals emphasized that families and their values were at the core of religious vitality and social behavior. Participants in the evangelical reading culture readily acknowledged that there were appropriate times for religious reading at home. Alexander A. Slayback of Shelbyville, Missouri, wrote in his journal on Sunday, February 11, 1844, that, quote, "he spent the day at home." Miss Isabella J. Cochran visited Slayback at his home, and Slayback says of Cochran, quote, "She came here last evening at my request to read to Maria," this was Alexander's wife, "and myself of one of Mr. Mesker's sermons on justification. I am still so hoarse that I can hardly speak plainly. Spent all the latter part of the day in a pleasant manner in prayer, reading, and religious conversation," end quote. This last comment by Slayback underscores that reading was an important component of the religious activity that took place within the home. Reading was an activity that involved each member of the family. It informed the fathers, it inspired the mothers. Reading also instructed the children. According to an Illinois and Missouri Farmer's Almanac from April 1848, the choice of reading materials determined the intellectual and moral path of a child. Quote, "Your children's scholarship," the almanac told parents, "depends more on what books you furnish them with than on how much school you give them." End quote. In light of this advice, parents opted for religious reading materials. J.W. Flint's parents were one couple in many who adhered to the axiom that the selection of reading materials influenced their child's intelligence. Flint's upbringing in Illinois instilled in him a penchant for reading as a key component of his religion, and religion as a component of his education. His schooling at home was, quote-unquote, strictly religious. Flint remembered that his family, quote, always had the church newspapers and religious books, and that he was, quote, encouraged to read them, end quote. By appealing to the subscribers as entire families, the editors of these evangelical newspapers and their boosters stressed that the ideal place for reading these periodicals was within the home. Since the home was the nexus of religious vitality, then appropriation of religious reading was necessary for the religious and moral direction of the family. For example, the Western Christian Advocate published the article entitled "The Value of a Religious Paper." The article stressed that the true value of such a paper was its utility for the family. Quote, "Every family ought to have a weekly religious newspaper," it stated. "A family that takes such a paper can easily be distinguished from one that does not by their enlarged information and sympathy. Their minds scan the moral horizon, and their hearts beat to a measure of a larger love to the church and to the world. It aids the father and mother in the religious education of their children. It furnishes Sunday reading of a pure character. It gives a higher tone to the conversation of the table and the fireside. A clergyman can tell at once by their zeal, interest, and intelligence the household in his parish that are blessed with such weekly messengers of truth and salvation," end quote. By locating the act of reading in the home, promoters of evangelical periodicals also oriented readers' outlook. Just as reading religious and non-religious topics conditioned how readers approached secular topics, so too did reading at home allow readers to weigh national and regional affairs against their immediate local experiences. Promoters encouraged reading as a means of bringing the national content into the domestic sphere and then bring the events of the home back outward into a public arena. Editors of evangelical periodicals encouraged reading as a family activity through the organizations of their paper's columns. And here I'll get to the screen that shows this. Departmentalization encouraged each member of the family to take up and read while also affirming certain gender roles. Historian Thomas C. Leonard has claimed that newspaper reading in the early American Republic was a male-dominated activity. Such a dominance of males over the consumption of information in newspapers enforced gender stereotypes that men were the ones invested in political and commercial affairs of the times. However, Leonard's account of this reading at the hearth, as he calls it, leaves little room for the reading activities of children, youth, or even women. Evangelical periodicals also offered departments for all three parts of the family: the husband, father figure, the wife, mother figure, and the children. And here I'll point to an example of, excuse me, this is a little blurry here, but this is an example of a page out of the Central Christian Advocate from, trying to remember the date there's a little fuzzy. I believe this was from the 1880s. And what you begin to notice is that this is a section where up at the top it says the housekeeper's department. So clearly geared towards who as the reader?
The housekeeper, which is usually male?
No. Female, right. This is geared towards female. And then look at what's interesting about this is in addition to the content itself is the advertisements are geared towards female. So the spring humors and the sarsaparilla, right? These were basically the Wonder Cure drinks that you would have at the time. An advertisement for an organ, another advertisement for a piano, assuming who's playing the musical instruments in the family parlor.
The women.
The women are, right. So you have this women's department advertisements that clearly are intending that the women are reading here. And then the other thing, which you don't really see very well here, is that there's another heading right here that says little folks. So you have a juxtaposition of content for women with content for children, which assumes what about the role of the initial religious instruction of the kids?
They read to by their mother?
Exactly, that the mother plays a role in reading to the children. Okay? This departmentalization actually helps to reinforce certain expectations of gender roles or roles within the family by saying who gets to read what parts of the paper. Let me continue. Evangelicals preferred family worship to be led by the elder males, and their periodicals reinforced that preference. In 1861, the Central Christian Advocate printed an article entitled Family Worship, which stressed paternal leadership in families reading the Bible together. The father, quote, holds on his knees the sacred book from which he reads a portion with judicious care, end quote. Meanwhile, all the other members of the family, including the elder daughter's suitor, sit and listen attentively. The wife brimming with pride over her husband's command. After the leader has finished reading the text, quote, they all kneel and the priest, the father, the husband prays. The image of this family worship asserts the necessity of male leadership in reading the Bible and in leading family prayer. Evangelical newspapers, however, offered opportunities for each family member to participate in reading these periodicals by these departments, specifically catered to different family members. While periodicals encouraged the patriarchal leadership of domestic devotional practices, departments in evangelical periodicals catered to their reading niches of various members and families. As early as 1844, the Western Christian Advocate had printed separate sections for female and juvenile readers. Its, quote, ladies' department and, quote, youth's department often appeared on the bottom corners of the last page, suggesting that the paper was at the disposal of the family members once the head of the household had completed reading it. So this was like a 4-page paper, and once you got to the back side is once you got to the information that was catered towards the women and the children. So once the father was done reading everything that he needed to read, he would say, here you go, you can read the rest. The Central Christian Advocate followed suit in The Central Christian Advocate followed suit in the 1860s when the editor of the Western Christian Advocate was appointed the editor of the Central Christian Advocate. By 1869, and then throughout much of the 1870s, the departments for females and juveniles moved to the inside of the paper. And this is actually as the format of the page changed to be a slightly smaller format page and looking a little bit more like a booklet form. Often these columns were hardly distinguishable from others. In later manifestations, the departments designated for female and juvenile readers had mastheads that proudly announced who was intended for the audience. And this is where I get back to the example that I just showed you, where there's headings that actually give you a hint as to whom. These are interior pages. So the exterior pages were like the front page headline news. The back page might be like the market notices or advertisements, but stuck inside would be the ladies department, the poetry, the Sunday school corner, the stuff for the kids. Now imagine, why do you stuff that all in the middle? What does this say about the social environment in which the evangelicals sit to read? Yeah, Jason.
Excuse me. Spartan, I think it would mean that usually the most important things are on the front or at the back. They just flip it. You know, you can just flip the paper over, read the back, flip it, read the front, and you'd pretty much be done if it was most important to you. But
yeah. So that information, which was considered to be the most pertinent for outside of the home, are located in sections of the paper that the father would read. Now imagine that the interior pages were those specifically for the mother and the child. And now these are newspapers, right? Like does anybody still read the newspaper, like the newspaper, right? What can you do with the newspaper after you've unfolded? You take sections out, right? You can pull it apart. And this is what this was intended, so that the exterior pages, that which the father would read, would be the like outside 2 pages, and then the 2 to 4 pages on the inside was the leaflets you could pull out and give over to the mother so that she could read or read to her children, while the father could sit in his chair and read all of the other news.
Oh, so they would be reading, even just like we do on our phones now, they would be reading different things at the same time.
Yeah.
But from the same paper.
Yes. And if ever you're interested in an interesting account of this that actually is more in the 1950s, Wayne Wiegand wrote in a book called Genre Reflecting, he wrote the introduction to it, in which he tells this story about how growing up as a kid in the 1950s, his dad would always read the front page news and give Wayne the sports section, and the living section went to his mom, right? And they would sit in the living room and all read the paper at the same time, but everybody had their own sections, and sometimes they would discuss it, but sometimes they would just sit quietly and read. So this division of evangelical periodicals into respective departments affirmed certain gender roles. How so? Well, the father's reading all that public notice stuff, right? The big headline stuff, what's going on inside of the denomination, what are the major theological points, right? What's some of the other national news or state news that's going on? What are the market notices? What are the advertisements, right? All assuming that the father's role is what goes on outside of the home, because it's all the outside of the home news. By contrast, the more sentimental literature, the more domestic-oriented literature is for the mother and the child to read. Okay? So this reinforces a certain notion of the roles of various family members within the home, and also assumes a certain patriarchal authority. In addition, it reorients how evangelicals think about the world around them. The sanctity of the home and the family rested in its reflection of the cosmic order of creation. Let me continue. In January, on 22nd of January, 1873, the issue of the Central Christian Advocate, a set of articles in the same column discussed space, order, and the family. And it went as follows. The first article, is there a central heaven? So a theological. followed by order in creation, another theological issue. So very cosmic-oriented topics. And the set was completed with another article that talked about family government. So very cosmic order sort of things, and then getting right down to domestic order. And these were just in sequence how these articles went on the page. By first introducing the reader to the probability that the universe has a center around which it is ordered, the paper then described how that order is reflected in the natural world as well as within the home. Moving from the grandest space of the universe into more immediate spaces of human experiences, the articles suggested that the home's order and harmony were necessary in order to comply with God's design. Whether consciously arranged for that purpose or not, the set of articles nevertheless would have given some readers a sense of their obligation to govern their families just as God had ordered and governed his own celestial home. The function of religious papers as informing evangelical families was a major selling point for boosters. Advertisements for these papers frequently referred to them as quote-unquote family papers, more commonly than as denominational papers. Religious periodicals served as signifiers of a family's devotion to religious reading and to a community of faith. The Central Baptist said, quote, "A Baptist family without a religious newspaper is like a ship without colors, or a ship without a flag," end quote. This identification was pronounced in the physical presence of the paper in the home, but also in the way that the papers shaped their readers' outlook. They included religious and non-religious matters. The prospectus for the Missouri Baptist made a priority to inform potential subscribers that, quote, "As a family paper it shall be inferior to none, and will likewise contain reports of the markets and a summary of the most important news, and etc." End quote. The Missouri Baptist Journal said in its prospectus, quote, "A portion of the paper will be devoted to literature, to news, to juvenile reading, and that class of advertisement not of an immoral tendency." I'm not sure what advertisements in the 1840s would have been of an immoral tendency, but it will therefore, we hope, be a good family newspaper. So something about the wholesome quality of the content was oriented towards a family readership. This collection of information aided in the cultivation of a worldview of the family's members. The article, quote, "Essential for every family, each family," opened by affirming, quote, "This is a good rule. The families compose the church, and all families need religious information and a knowledge of the world around them," end quote. Evangelicals kept this knowledge of markets and literature in harmony with their values by printing those quote-unquote secular topics alongside the news of the affairs of the church and articles that served as devotional reading. Therefore, the content held religious and non-religious topics together such that readers would interpret one through the lens of the other. So you would interpret non-religious matters by how you were informed by certain articles of the faith. The religious periodicals of the region that I studied were also instrumental in joining together evangelicals within the region, creating what Benedict Anderson called an imagined community, if anybody's familiar with that literature. Periodicals printed local accounts as a way of informing readers that they were participating in greater religious events on a national or regional scale. In 1857 and 1858, the pages of the Methodist Central Christian Advocate and its Baptist counterpart, the Western Watchman, announced that revival had reached the region in which these readers lived. The front page of the February 18, 1858 Western Watchman gave 3 notices from Illinois and Missouri. The revivals, 2 being more than 130 miles apart from each other, indicated that a pervasive religious movement was beginning to sweep the region. In Quincy, Illinois, the Vermont Street Baptist Church had been holding, quote, "evening meetings for several weeks," end quote. In Springfield, Illinois, a Baptist observed that, quote, "our brethren are still laboring in this glorious revival," end quote. Meanwhile, in Clark County, Missouri, Reverend William Yachtin, quote, "has been holding protracted meetings with the Bethlehem Church," end quote, resulting in the addition of 13 members. Likewise, the Central Christian Advocate frequently reprinted its quote-unquote revival column on its second page. The January 14, 1857 issue included revival reports from the Palestine Circuit in Illinois, the Clarinda Circuit in Iowa, the Mount Carmel District and Grayville Circuit in southern Illinois. So these disparate areas all having revivals going on at the same point. John Glare of the Grayville Circuit wrote that his church had been having a protracted meeting since New Year's Eve, so for 2 weeks. And William Halber proudly announced that his church in Clarinda, Iowa, had experienced revival for 8 days. Evangelicals in the region were aware that their local revivals were part of something larger than just a local event. The Central Christian Advocate, for example, reprinted a short excerpt from the New York Times, calling this revival that was going on in the nation in 1857 and 58, quote, the most remarkable movement since the Reformation, end quote. This so-called businessmen's revival that had gripped the middle class in New York and Boston after the financial collapse of 1857. But the revival that took place in states like Illinois, Missouri, and Iowa served alternate purposes for the development of evangelicalism. The revival notices in the Central Christian Advocate and the Western Watchman reflected and encouraged a mode of communication within the region that fortified a certain regional identity. So if I'm participating in a revival at my local church, and it just so happens that 5 other revivals are going on, in some cases more than 100 miles away from us, maybe we're all experiencing some miraculous work of God simultaneously. And if that's going on, and if it seems to be so intensely clustered within the region that just so happens to be the readership of this newspaper that I pick up and read, it would seem like God's doing something really specifically in places of Illinois, Missouri, and Iowa at that time. The revival tradition of the region gave its residents a way of interacting with one another and communicating these kinds of local accounts across space and time. And in some cases, what happened is these revival notices weren't always necessarily specifically at the exact same time. They might be like days apart or weeks apart. But because the way these accounts were reprinted side by side, it looks like this is all happening very immediately, right? You read about something that happened in January and something happened in February and something happened in March. But because it's all on one page, you think, wow, all this stuff's happening at the same time. Readers took interest in the affairs of their brothers and sisters in other locations. The Central Baptist published a letter in 1879 from a reader in Iowa who inquired about Baptists in Missouri and Illinois. In Iowa, quote, in Iowa, we like to know about the Baptists of other states and how they are doing. If they are advancing, we want to rejoice with them, end quote. And he continued, do others like to know about us? We are vain enough to think that they do, and hence I provide you with these local accounts. The author then offered notices about various congregations within the state of Iowa and what was going on at that time. Some evangelicals likened their religious periodicals to large religious gatherings. In 1868, a reader of the Central Baptist from Burnt Prairie, Illinois, recognized how reading the paper was akin to a meeting of Baptists who were knit together by this newspaper. He wrote, quote, we are by means of our paper drawn so near to each other every week that it is the next thing to a warm personal greeting. The same words of good cheer greet us, the same principles animate us, and we become daily more and more endeared to each other, until the names of the brothers and sisters who we may never see in the flesh become household words. Indeed, it is the next thing to a great gathering of Baptists of the entire state, to rejoice or weep together as the good or evil passes in review before us. I am pleased, much pleased, in the Central Baptist, both its mind and body, and I will take pleasure in urging it upon the consideration of my people, end quote. Seeing that reading the religious periodical of the region was similar to social religious exercises, the author described readers sharing space and time in their encounter with one another through the printed page. In addition, the author recognized that both interpersonal and literary meetings of evangelicals helped to forge a sense of community by allowing them to share sentiments of the evangelical religious experience. The Baptist gentleman in Burnt Prairie, Illinois, reiterated a social phenomenon of evangelical print culture more than a century old. That is, religious periodicals especially serve to supplement and replicate the local religious gathering. The papers gathered readers together into shared space and time. They also created a communication public sphere in which the individual makes his or her interior spiritual or emotional state available for the group to consume and digest. And just as a sidebar, I see this as the earliest signs of a kind of social media, right? These people are posting things. Essentially, the front page of the newspaper serves as a kind of public wall on which you're starting to share your own local church notices or your own personal experiences. Evangelical periodicals in this region also reinforced for readers the sense that their homes in their region were at the center of their worlds. They achieved this goal by telling readers that the regional content of the papers was more important than content from other parts of the country. One article in the Central Christian Advocate that promoted itself said, quote, "We are convinced that the province of the religious press is to confine itself to narrow limits," end quote. The article did not mean that the paper restricted itself to topics of religious content. Instead, it meant that a religious paper should include information most relevant to the region that the paper served. Even content of a non-religious nature could and should be included insomuch as the content addressed the immediate concerns of the readers in that region. The article continued, quote, "They may and do convey all the commercial information necessary for the body of the farming community and for storekeepers in the region where they circulate," end quote. By contrast, information from outside the region was not always beneficial to the readers. Quote, "The commercial news of Eastern religious papers are mostly of no value to Western readers." So basically not interested in what's going on the Atlantic coast. End quote. And then continuing, quote, "The same may be said of Western papers for Eastern readers. A London or Paris paper may furnish as suitable commercial intelligence for the people of the West as one issued in the Eastern city, or for the people of the East as one published in the West." It's basically saying, really only our local interests are what all that matters here. We don't need to know about what's going on in New York or Boston or London or Paris. We need to know about what's going on in these small towns in Illinois, Missouri, Iowa. In distinguishing what information was most beneficial for the readers, the Central Christian Advocate determined that there were indeed regional distinctions amongst evangelicals based on how the regions determined their livelihoods. Furthermore, the selection of regional information affirmed to readers that their immediate interactions with the political, commercial, and religious affairs of the region were at the crucial point of their lives, was at the center of their lives. The arrangement of content in the Central Baptist and in the Central Christian Advocate oriented readers to understand that the nation as an extension of their homeland. In 1858, notices of religious affairs in Illinois and Missouri frequently appeared on the first page of the Central Christian Advocate, drawing the reader to read about the region before encountering any other information within the periodical. Correspondents in portions of the region supplied those notices. However, by 1877, the organization had shifted. Beginning with January 31 issue of 1877, the paper printed a series of lengthy letters from a correspondent in New York City. To ensure that readers still access news from their region, the paper began to include a home conference column on page 7, a significant rupture from earlier patterns. So imagine that the information that you expected to be on page 1, which is the local news, now makes it to page 7. Now, back in the days when people actually read the newspaper, trying to get to page 7 was somewhat of a disappointment, right? The first page is always the most important stuff. To ensure that readers still, the collections within these home conference columns affirmed the relationship of the readers with the paper's point of origin within the region that they lived. On the 9th of May, 1877, the Home Conference Department printed notices from the Illinois, Southern Illinois, Des Moines, Iowa, St. Louis, Colorado, and the quote-unquote Southwestern German conferences of the Methodist Church. Again, on the 22nd of August of 1877, the department listed Illinois, Southern Illinois, St. Louis, and Iowa, along with neighboring conferences in Arkansas and Kansas. So the whole notion of where the region is begins to shift. It was very localized within a few states, primarily small towns. And now notice it's starting to expand out. It's Arkansas, it's Kansas, it's Colorado, right? The geographic scope begins to expand outward. These collections drew a boundary around these conferences and pointed to their geographic and cultural proximity. So all of a sudden, you begin to look at what counts as home news, and home news is not just what's going on in my small town in Illinois, but now it's what's going on in Arkansas and Colorado and et cetera. It redefines what is home news to you. It also redefines your connection to certain parts of the country. Not only did these arrangements stress the cohesion of evangelicals within the region and its neighboring areas, the order of correspondence organized space according to a certain core periphery distinction. For example, the religious intelligence column in the Central Baptist on the 8th of October 1868 placed the localities that readers encountered into a hierarchy that began with the immediate, most familiar spaces, and then outwardly at various concentric circles, if you will. The list began with what was going on in St. Louis County, Missouri, the home of the Central Baptist newspaper, and of many of its readers. From there, the list of correspondents moved outward. Cape Girardeau in southeastern Missouri, Shelby, Bates, and Cooper counties in Missouri, Bond County, Illinois came after that, highlighting that readers in Illinois were intimately related to the readers of Missouri. The outer reaches were Arkansas and Texas. In contrast, New England appeared at the periphery. Notices from Connecticut and Massachusetts were the last two American places put on this notice list before the quote-unquote foreign missionary field section. By juxtaposing New England accounts with those from abroad, this list evinces the paradigm of Baptists within this region, a paradigm that considered New England, and really the Atlantic coast, as a periphery of their world, far removed from their immediate experiences. Such a conception of space, coupled with the aspirations held by many residents in the valley for the Mississippi Valley's future within the national sphere, or national kind of political and economic direction, provided the foundation of how residents within that region challenged the authority of what they perceived as the elitism or dominance of the Northeast. Methodists and Baptists in the Mississippi Valley area were critical of the dominance of the Northeast in their respective denominations. Although Baptists did not have a centralized denominational structure, they nonetheless had national organizations that held central offices in key Atlantic cities. Some of these Baptists believed that these organizations and their locations in the East marginalized people in the West, especially marginalizing those Western people who had contributed their own financial resources to these national organizations, but that those people in the West that had contributed these financial resources had very little say in actually how the national organization got governed. Stop me if this sounds familiar. Okay, somebody got it. In the article, quote, Decentralization in the Central Baptist, an author lamented that the consolidation of power of the Baptist fellowship within a few urban areas, principally in the Northeast, was the problem. The author was not opposed necessarily to the centrality of authority. Instead, he disagreed with where that centrality of authority was and at the expense of all people out on the periphery of it. Quote, things must, of course, have a center, end quote, the article affirmed. And then continues, quote, but if they would amount to much, they must also have a considerable circumference. The Baptists of the North have three great organizations for doing denominational work. The Missionary Union is headquarters in Boston. The Home Missionary Society, headquarters in New York. And the American Baptist Publication Society, headquarters in Philadelphia. As a consequence, it has come to pass that the first named society is unfortunately regarded as a Boston institution. The second as a New York affair, and the third as a protege of Philadelphia, end quote. So saying, look, these national Baptist organizations are really serving the interests of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, not the people in small towns in Illinois, Missouri, Iowa, Arkansas. For this author, the problem with centrality was that the Baptist organizations had set up their headquarters in metropoles where many Baptists in the South and in the West could not participate. The author took up a populist tone in clamoring for inclusion. Quote, ought not the voice of the denomination be heard? End quote, the author asked rhetorically. Quote, ought not our churches everywhere be brought to feel that they have not only a right to be heard, but a chance to be heard? That these societies belong not to the several cities where their boards happen to be located, but to all Baptists, north, south, east, and west, end quote. Advocating the inclusion of all Baptists in the decisions made by the National Baptist Boards, the author was affirming a tenet of Baptist polity. The local congregation was to be empowered in order to direct its own course and in order to contribute to the direction of Baptist activities beyond the local level. However, because many Baptists felt excluded, marginalized, this organizational structure that betrayed that tenet of Baptist governance. Therefore, this article offered a corrective that national boards in the Northeast were responsible to Baptists in other regions, and so there needs to be more input from those Baptists in other parts of the country. In the Mississippi Valley region, evangelicals sought to continue promoting their own values through their own periodicals. In fact, one of the stories that I traced when I researched these was this kind of internal denominational politicking, if you will, about regions, about folks in Illinois, Missouri, and surrounding areas said, we don't want to read the news that comes out of Chicago. We don't want to read the news that comes out of Philadelphia or Boston or upstate New York. That's not us. We want to read our own local regional newspapers. That's why we want to cater our own information to ourselves. So they create their own alternative media networks. And in so doing, they reinforce their local events as the most important thing of their lives. And that's informed by their own reinforcement of their own religious values. The periodicals intersected domestic spaces through the act of reading in the homes. Remember, it's all about how localized we can focus here. These papers were agents of preserving readers approved of the periodicals and their purposes. One reader observed in 1886, it is noticeable, too, that in the last 20 years there has been manifest improvement in what may be called the religious or pastoral character of our denominational papers. That is, there is less of controversy, less of individualism. The religious journal has given greater attention to experimental religion and everyday Christian living, end quote. Continuing to affirm the evangelical experiential aspects of religion, the periodicals also informed, molded, and reflected the everyday lives of their readers. As readers ordered their everyday lives according to the values expressed in the pages of their periodicals, they came to understand that the seemingly insignificant aspects of their lives, such as their prayer and their charity, played a significant role in larger public arenas. The readers who overlapped their private and public spheres had come to identify themselves with other readers in the region. And at the same time, the discourse of national information also mediated an identification with their own individual experiences and with their own identity as Americans. In addition, readers came to think of their region as critical to the nation. They came to think of events in their homes and their homeland as central to all of America, and they made their homeland into what I have identified as the American heartland. Well, I probably went a little longer than I should have, but we got about 15 minutes if anybody has any questions.
Wait, so this was something you wrote?
Yes.
That is... Wow. I mean, I guess this is a thesis, you said?
This is a portion of my doctoral dissertation.
Because, I mean, I know they're long, but man, I've just never heard anything like that. That's really good.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So your topic was religion, basically?
Yes, my PhD is in religious studies with a focus in American history.
Oh, wow. Okay,
Yeah.
That's good. Okay.
Specifically focusing on American evangelicalism in the 19th century, print media,
So that's why all of it was about newspaper and other things
Yes,
like that.
yeah. My dissertation was on the Methodist newspaper, the Central Christian Advocate, and the Baptist newspaper, the Central Baptist. I was intrigued by why they named it Central, as it had something to do with their claims to this is the real America, this is the center of America, that sort of thing.
Oh, just kind of like how we in Indiana talk about America's heartland.
Yes, I grew up in Indiana. I originally came across this idea while I was doing research in Illinois, and I was very intrigued by the idea of what does it mean to claim that there is such a thing as an American heartland? There is really no such thing as a heartland outside of the realm of very abstract value systems, right? I mean, you can say any region of the country is the heartland depending on what you identify as the so-called value systems.
Yeah.
Right?
A lot of people, I guess, just name it with the South more than anything else, but at least that's what I've seen.
I mean, the South usually gets called more the Bible Belt than the heartland. But other people who might have questions or thoughts. Yeah.
I was going to ask this before you began kind of alluding to other political things that are happening currently. But I was going to say, how relevant do you think print is today? And do you think that some of the strategies that you discussed earlier are still being used to shape the way that we...
Okay, great question.
I mean, I still read things on paper, but I think obviously with digital.
Readership has shifted digital by and large, right? So we have to account for the fact that once readership has shifted digital, not that readership was ever really very well regulated here in America. I mean, we have something called the freedom of the press, right? So it's not uncommon that in all kinds of social movements, you're going to have the rise of some sort of medium, some sort of literature out there. In my other hobby, because I teach the history of rock and roll here, one of the things I'm always fascinated by are fanzines, right? So anytime you see a new music movement, there's a fanzine that pops up. This, particularly in the old days when you actually had like newsletters that people would run things off Xerox machines and like hand out at shows and back alleys and all that sort of stuff. Like that's where fanzines kind of, but nowadays you can have like e-fanzines, right? That you have all these online forums talking about musical movements that's like nobody even knows what these are except for the 12 people that are on this website just constantly posting about it. But that's also very true about all kinds of social and cultural phenomena, right? So you will probably notice, if you're going to pay attention to the media for the next couple of weeks, there's going to be a very clear identification of the alt-right media, right? That there is such a thing out there, and that it had been very, very active over the past 6 years, really, in mobilizing a populist movement, right? A populist movement that gave rise to certain voting trends. Now, whether or not you agree with that is besides the point. That is going to be something that we recognize, and that is largely an electronic-based movement. It had a print element, and even like if anybody paid attention to the headlines, I think it was last week, everybody was making a big deal about the KKK's newsletter came out and endorsed a particular presidential candidate. I said, wow, they still print a paper version of this? That was my initial response. Like, they're still they've got a mailing list? That's it's kind of old hat style of doing things. But the point being is that when we look at alternative media practices, that's when you can begin to identify a certain social or cultural movement that's going on, and a certain community that identifies with that's how they want to get their information. And that's where they feel safe to share their experiences. Right? It's very much the same way of how the Methodists and Baptists felt like, I feel it's much safer to share my experiences regionally than nationally. Yeah.
It's interesting how the shift to e-media may have changed the regional aspect, because in modern evangelicalism, I'm seeing a lot of people movements gather around literature, like blogs, for instance. There are people who almost identify their theology with certain blogs, like certain, for instance, Reformed blogs. But it seems like it's bringing people together from all over the country around a theological position as opposed to something regional.
Yeah, and that also goes back into print media as well. You have any number of movements that were these kind of their own strains of national media channels, right? I mean, even if you were to look at like magazines throughout the 20th century, if you had a niche interest in something, you could, if you really were into Better Homes and Gardens, you read Better Homes and Gardens. Now, what's interesting, a phenomenon that happens in the 20th century is even a magazine like Better Homes and Gardens has regionally catered content and advertising. So there's basically like 5 or 6 different versions of Better Homes and Gardens out there, right? You have, and then you have the development of Southern living, Midwest living, New England living, right? You have all these kinds of regionally catered things. Now, what you're getting at is an important feature of, in the electronic sphere, it is completely not, because the distribution is very different, right? When you had print media, you distributed to certain parts of the country, so you catered what you wanted to that part of the country. In an electronic format, because anybody can sign on, or even if it's paywall protected, if you choose to subscribe, you're in. And it doesn't matter where you're from, right? You could be from Fort Wayne, you could be from Denver, you could be somewhere in Belgium, for all that matters, right? You could all participate in this certain, and whatever that interest is, and like you said, in evangelicalism, it becomes movements associated with certain value systems. What are those value systems, and who do we look at as the luminaries to promote those kinds of ideas for us? And it is changing the dynamic. Now, what's interesting is that in a given congregation, because people still attend local congregations, if you really knew what these people read, you would find that in a room full of 100 people, there may be like 40 different opinions, because people are encountering different forms of media, or different media outlets, I should say, and where they get their content and how they read and interpret that content.
Don't you get subgroups there that'll communicate with each other to go to the same locations, even with their online sources? I mean, I noticed that especially within certain more close-knit communities within congregations that are smaller congregations, you still have a lot of influence there. Even though they're reaching out to international or transnational or just national websites, they're still unifying in their in where they're getting their information.
Yeah, I mean, it's the matter of to what extent do they sit down and talk about the differences of what content they're reading, encountering, and what they think about that. That's if you ever want to have a good time and try not to lose your mind in the process, is scan through all of your fairly local friends on Facebook and check out what they're posting, right? And in the interest of full disclosure, the town that I grew up in and the people that I know and like the stuff that they post, and I'm like, this is like, this is fringe stuff, right? As far as like what they read, and I'm like, I grew up down the street from you, and I don't agree with your position on religious topics, political topics, whatever, but you're like citing fringe stuff, and that goes both directions, right? I mean, and so what I'm getting at is that even in a locality where people gather together, they may not necessarily be encountering the same content. Now, the Midwest is unique, or unique's not the right word, but the Midwest is interesting in the sense of we have this Midwest nice, right? So we just choose not to talk about some things in front of people face to face. Right? We have no problem hashing it out in the comments section, but we don't want to talk about it face to face with somebody.
Yeah. Oof.
I don't know. I think that I would disagree, especially with regards to like something like a church, where you have people communing together based on ideology. Now, if you're talking about a much larger church where people join together, something like the Catholic Church, where they tend to have more dissenting opinions, they have more of a long history of open dissent within their own ranks. I could see that, but I mean, especially when you're talking about something like an evangelical church or the ones that tend to be much more indoctrinated with regards to their politic and incorporating that into the religion, I don't know. I don't know if I see that.
Well, I think you'd have to look at, let me give another instance in a case of full disclosure. I attend a church here in town that I, for the life of me, could not sit through a Sunday school class because the timbre of the conversation is beyond, for me, rationality. in the sense of like, if we just stopped and thought about this and talked about this for a second, we could probably understand the answers much better, but you just want to continue to hammer through a certain angle on it. So my church attendance is basically, I show up at 9 a.m. on Sunday, I sit through music, I sit through a sermon that I don't listen to because my kids are with me and I'm making sure they're not throwing crap on the ground, and then I leave, right? So like my participation is about this big, but I'm in a church with a bunch of people that I very disagree with on a number of theological and political topics, and it just is something that I don't avail myself of the social environment to engage in.
Why don't you find a new church?
We'll talk about that later.
I
Yeah.
actually listen to a lot of evangelical radio. I'm not evangelical, but I find it interesting. And I was listening to something the other night about there being a really large progressive movement within the evangelical religion. So I feel like that's a pretty big.
It's actually, it's most interesting because it's going on in a virtual environment, right? So one of my hobbies, in addition to posting pictures about my kids on Facebook, is I follow a bunch of just religious virtual groups on Facebook, just because I'm curious, like, what are their discussion points? But, you know, I studied 19th century religious social media, for Pete's sake. So I'm going to study, and it's, you know, it's what do Methodists talk about? What do Lutherans talk about? What do Catholics talk about? What do Muslims talk about? You know, I'm just interested in all that kind of stuff. And one of the things I found very interesting this morning was, so there's this group called Progressive Methodists, right? And this morning, a bunch of progressive-minded ministers who were talking about, I can't believe my parishioners voted like this, right? It's a safe space for them all to say, we're actually like politically left of center, but we serve parishes that are right of center, and we can't talk about this, so we find this virtual environment to do it. And we can't bring it up at Church General Conference because we might get outed as a liberal, right? So they have to be very guarded in how they approach this, and so that's where some of these progressive movements or liberal movements sometimes are going on virtually, and some of them secretly hope they go to a locality where they can be at a liberal congregation and feel comfortable. Like a friend of mine from college ended up going to New York City, and he finally felt comfortable being in an inclusive congregation, and he spouts all kinds of left-wing stuff, right? But again, that's in a virtual environment. They feel very uncomfortable on the ground level in an actual face-to-face setting. Yeah.
Now, do you feel like there's parallels to like the 1800s wave of newspapers where where they only put certain things and they only talk about certain things, to now people sort of just ignoring things that don't operate within the sphere of things that they believe, sort of?
Well, yeah, so there's this great book about newspaper publishing during the American Revolution that was called The Tyranny of Printers. And basically what it said was that newspaper editors controlled content. And guess what? This is no surprise, right? Yes, we have a freedom of press, but it's ultimately decided by who owns it, who publishes it, who edits it, right? The content is largely dictated by that. And the content of these newspapers is conditioned by who's the editor. And one of the editors for the Western Christian Advocate, and eventually becomes the editor of the Central Christian Advocate, is this Irish immigrant by the name of Charles Eliot. And Charles Eliot is like, for 19th century standards, a little bit left of center theologically, in the sense of like he's willing to think through things from a more, you know, he went to college in Ireland, so he's influenced by the Scottish Enlightenment and some of that sort of stuff. So he has a slightly different approach to things, but is insanely anti-Catholic, right? And even to the point that he says that Anglicans or Episcopalians are just too Catholic for him. Now, granted, he grew up in Ireland, where that's basically true. For him, I mean, for him as an Irish Methodist, everything that wasn't Methodist was basically Catholic. And the Irish Methodists were such a small minority, and they were so repressed by both Catholics and Anglicans that he just had a big chip on his shoulder. So he's insanely anti-Catholic. Actually writes the anti-Catholic book for the Methodist Church. He's very anti-slavery at the same time. So he continually, like this is St. Louis, Missouri, where he's living at the time, and publishing all this virulently anti-slavery stuff in a city where slavery is legal, right? He's very pro-union, shares an office building with another Methodist newspaper editor who's pro-secession. And in fact, their offices were one floor apart from one another, and he drapes an American flag out of his window to cover over the other guy's window, right? So this, like, here's a guy, and he continually manipulates what he wants in the paper to point to what he believes is what the denomination, where he sees the denomination going, and particularly in that region. And he thinks that he's at the front lines of some sort of contest there. So that is to the exclusion of any number of other voices, even though he'll claim, like, I'm fine with, I want all kinds of people to voice their opinions on whatever, and yet he'll allow those in some cases, and then he'll put an editorial in there about why that person's wrong. So, yeah.
Sorry, just real quick.
No.
I know that there's no way I can expect you to actually answer this, but in your opinion...
Remember, I don't have tenure.
In your opinion, do you see social media as a unifier or something that causes divisions? Because I can see it as unifying in the fact that people are able to seek out their information from many different sources and perhaps unite with people from other regions that they would never be able to reach before. And also in the fact that, like we were just talking about Kelsey, they can voice their not so PC opinions with other people who have the same thoughts as them and save face in the real world, but have an outlet there, but at the same time they have access to so many different kinds of information that causes them to have conflicting views maybe with their peers. I don't know what I'm asking right now. So what do you think? In the sum of everything.
No, it's a great question. How many of you have watched the movie The Social Network? Right, the one about Facebook, about Zuckerberg. There's a great scene in the early part of the movie. Zuckerberg's character badmouths an ex-girlfriend, right? And kind of halfway through the movie, he sees this ex-girlfriend at a bar and says, hey, I just started this website, I'm really successful, and she blows him off. And he says, you know, what's the deal? And she says, angry people write things in a dark room. And that line has always resonated with me because, and this goes both directions, it's not just, you know, to the right, I've seen it in the left as well, that people can hide behind avatars, right? Like they can create a fake identity if they want in social media and say whatever they want to say. They can choose to be very friendly, or, you know, even if you have your own like personal account and you choose to, you know, I identify this is who I am and it's actually me, it's my picture, it's my name, it's, you know, all that, and be very, very friendly in one comment stream and just virulent as all get out in one where they feel like it's a safe space. And we saw that get a little heated over the past 2 months, but it got real ugly this morning. It got real ugly this morning, right? I mean, and that is something that we're going to have to contend with because now people are starting to show, and again, like a lot of my friends who I love very, very dearly, speaking horrendously about people on the right, right? Everybody shows their ugly faces, and they feel safe to do it because, again, it goes back to the point that I made. Like, if you don't have to look a person in the eye and tell them that, right? If you don't have to look that person in the eye, if you can just throw something up on a screen, you can hide behind that.
So you think it affords them more anonymity, even though, like, if you told it to a person's face, like, yeah, you'd have to deal with their facial expressions and their reprisal maybe, but they don't actually have it set in stone. But if you put something out on the internet, it could come back to bite you in the butt because it's there forever.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's that. There's also the hope that, like, well, if I post something on Wednesday morning, by the time that I see whoever on Saturday, you know, it's kind of like they've cooled off, right? So it's like they would say, hey, you know, what you posted really ticked me off. Be like, yeah, okay, well, you know, the sun still rises, you know, and it did, you know, 3 more times between the time I said that and Saturday. I mean, I think there's some of that, but I think there are some people that have not thought through the repercussions of, once it's out there, how long is it out there? Now, the folks I study, I just happen to be lucky enough to find their stuff because there's like hardly any collections of this. Like, the one Methodist newspaper, there's one collection up in Chicago. The Baptist newspaper, there's one collection in Nashville. It's all I've been able to find. And for the most part, since nobody cares about these newspapers except for me, nobody's read them or cited them, right? And they generally don't get too like nasty, but it's out there for posterity. It's printed or it's out there on the internet for posterity. It can be found. Yeah.
Thank you for being here. We're out
Oh,
of time.
sorry.
Do you think the PC movement in just America started with newspapers, or do you think it started way before newspapers were really a big thing in your research?
I mean, I haven't really researched the PC movement. I mean, generally the PC movement became a really big thing in the 90s, right? And it was more so, I mean, if I remember correctly, it was more so, don't open your mouth and say that, right? Especially when a camera is in front of you. Like that was kind of the starting point. And then it became, nowadays people say, well, there's the PC police that run around and tell people they can't say anything anywhere and all of that. And I get it. I mean, there's a point at which they just want to say what's on their minds. They want to scream into a pillow and get it out. I don't have a good answer for PC though. I mean, sorry, I don't.
We are actually all out of time.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm out of time.